Have you been seeing recently that a lot of the vibe has been going kind of towards vintage looking, film looking style photos? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. How to make your photos look vintage and look like film and look like old style that has that unique look that is kind of going upwards as the trends today. So let's take a look at how to do that. So the first thing to think about is grain. When you're at the Lightroom tab, there's three sliders for grain. There's amount, there's size, and there's roughness. So you gotta kind of play around with these a little bit, see what works for you based on how much grain you want to implement in your photos. What I like to do for grain is to make it so the background or the blurry side of the photo has grain, but maybe the foreground or the subject is not as grainy. So I kind of mess with the amount based on the composition of the photo. So the background has more grain, maybe the subject has less grain. I like to do that because it has that crisp look and it also plays into the blurriness of the photo where you can have a big distinguishable element of the foreground with the subject and the background. Number two is to think about the saturation. With photos that are vintage or film, they generally have desaturated tones all around. So I usually start off by desaturating all the colors, and then I go back in and maybe I can pick and choose a couple colors that I want to pop in the photo. Maybe I'll bring those up a little bit, but generally talking, have a desaturated look overall, and then you can kind of pick and choose what you want to pop in your photo. I generally like the blues and the oranges because I like the water tones as well as the skin tones. I generally shoot on the beach a lot, so that's usually yellow tones. So I usually desaturate that a lot and it kind of makes the beach look white if you think about that. So the next tip is to definitely desaturate your tones a little bit, and that'll help kind of have that vintage looking old style coloring and feel. The next tip is going to be working with the tone curve. What I like to do is bring up the blacks, bring down the whites a little bit so each element is a little bit faded and there's no true black point or no true white point. That kind of has this faded look overall, and that's what you like to see in old looking photos because they're old, maybe they're shot on film, maybe even sitting in the drawer for months or years. So they're a little bit faded, the colors, and that's kind of how you can do that with the tone curve. You want to be careful with doing it though. You don't want to over exaggerate it or it can look a little bit amateur. You want to keep the edits all subtle so it looks just a little bit crispy. You can tell, oh, that's a little old style, and just keep it a little subtle in the tone curve. This next tip is actually going to be working with during the shot when you're shooting out in the field. So this is going to be thinking about props that you're going to bring. If you want to have a vintage looking style shoot, maybe you want to have vintage style looking props. This could be old books, maybe like newspapers, old cameras, kind of vintage looking things, even unique things. You could just bring bottles and towels and things like that. Because if you're shooting maybe for like a 60s feel, 50s, 40s, 70s, 80s, there's not going to be those modern props like iPhones, brand new cars, things like that. So kind of think about that. I like to keep it very simple when I shoot. Maybe just bring something unique. Maybe it doesn't make sense, but if you and the model know how to use it, it can play really well in your favor. And that slides perfectly into the next tip when working in the field. That's the poses. You want to keep the poses very candid and simple. That's what I like to do. It kind of shows this unique feel. If you have very wild poses or it looks very posed, like smiling or just like a graduation shoot type of feel, and it's not going to look very simple or vintage. You want to have that unique stylish editorial look. So just get some simple poses, make sure you and the model are working well together, and that will make your vintage looking photos pop even more. So the next two tips are actually going to be working in Photoshop. The first one is the dust overlays. This kind of works as well with the grain. They're just a little bit more dusty, dirty. I'm sure you've seen them a little bit. You can just look at them on Google, download them, or there's some creative marketplaces that you can download elements like that. These dust elements kind of add a little bit more grungy feel. It's even more extreme than the dust. But you want to be careful when using these. You don't want them to take away from your photo or be distracting. So I usually even drop the opacity of them, might even erase it so if it's like on the person's face. You just want it to add to your photo. You don't want it to be distracting. So you can check those out. That's what I use sometimes with the dust overlays. The next thing that you can do when working with Photoshop is the film frames. You can look at these on Google as well and just drag and drop them onto your Photoshop frame. Or I go on Creative Market and you can download certain frames. You can see the style that you like. Some people like the Polaroid ones, some people like the more modern Kodak ones that have the writing. But these film overlays can kind of help bring everything together in the final piece of your project. The final tip with editing kind of brings this all together is that when you're shooting film or shooting a vintage looking photo, is that it's imperfect. Film is not perfect. That's kind of what makes it unique. When people are shooting digital photos nowadays, they focus on making everything perfect. Everything's balanced, the tone curve is perfect, everything. That's what you don't want to do when you're shooting these vintage looking feels. I like to make it even look imperfect on purpose. Maybe I'll blow out the highlights, or I'll bring the shadows up too much. That's what you want to take a look at, and just kind of play with that, make it imperfect, because that'll actually make it unique and give yourself a certain style that you like to do. If you're looking to have some help maybe with this vintage looking feel, everything that we discussed, the desaturation, the grain, the elements of the tone curve, my presets, especially Portrait 2.0 preset pack, it kind of has a big bundle of those presets that already have those elements. Either you can just take a look and learn from them, kind of see different things I do, or you just want to edit really quick and easy. You can just click the preset, adjust maybe a couple things, and it looks perfect already. That's what I use mainly on all my photos right now, is this Portrait 2.0 preset pack. There's even some black and white ones, which I use a lot. Those I don't even go away from. I haven't made any new black and white presets in like a year or so, just because I love them so much. We can definitely check those out there on my website or linked below in the description. Check those out, and there even is a 20% discount for YouTube viewers. You just use the coupon code YouTube and you get 20% off any of my presets. So these are the tips to help make your photos look film-like or vintage or kind of have that retro feel. Number one, we talked about the grain, kind of mess around with the grain elements. Number two is desaturating your photos. Make sure they don't have vibrant tones like that. Next look to think about is the tone curve. You kind of want to have a little bit of fade in the whites and as well as the darks. Next things we talked about were the poses that you want to have with your model. You want to keep them very simple, very candid, and then also bring props that kind of help play into the feel that you're trying to represent. And the next two things were in Photoshop, the dust overlays as well as the film overlays. Think about looking at those both, kind of look on Google, take a see what you can do with those. They're fun to play around with. Just take a look and see how you like those. Final thing is the keeping the photos imperfect. Maybe do something incorrect, maybe break the rules of photography. That's what people don't do very much often nowadays. So break the rules of photography, maybe make the highlights a little blown out. Maybe the skin isn't perfectly toned. Maybe it's a little blown out on this shoulder, or it's a little darker on the eyes. Kind of play around with that, but make yourself have a unique look and tone in your vintage looking photos. Thanks for watching today. I'm glad I could share these tips. This is all what I use personally when editing my photos for vintage looking or film look feel. Take a look at these elements, try them out, let me know how you like them. And if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe and comment. If there's any questions, feel free to leave them below, and I can help and try and get back to you as best as possible.